Security, certainly a hot topic in the payment card industry. And we can't talk about security and payment cards without talking about the acronym PCI, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. I want to talk a little bit about what the PCI Council does, what's its role in the world of payment security, talk about the role of the card brands such as MasterCard, and then talk about the role you play as service providers. We're going to talk about data breaches. We're going to talk about some of that low-hanging fruit. What's causing these breaches, what are some simple things to prevent a lot of the breaches that we see today. And then I'm going to be joined by two experts where we'll focus on the small merchant. We're going to talk about small merchant security and talk about what we see from a forensics side on compromises to small merchants. Let me begin with an overview of the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. The PCI Council does two things. It really boils down to just these two. The first is set security standards. The PCI Council is the original author of security standards governing the security of payment card data. Today we have 9 standards. We'll have 11 at the end of the year. The second core function of the PCI Council is awareness and education around those standards. So it's setting standards, it's doing awareness and education. That's really the remit of the PCI Council. When it comes to compliance to those standards, that is not the PCI Council. That's the individual card brands. So for example, MasterCard, we have the Site Data Protection Program. That's the program that I manage. It's governed by our rules that run through what you have to do for PCI compliance, how often you have to validate, to what standards, in what way, with what documentation. That's all governed by individual payment card brands, and each brand has a similar program. Now, the PCI Council governs the end-to-end process flow of payment security. So this is hardware, software, the environments that merchants and you as service providers play in, the certification of equipment of service providers, of certain products tied to standards, and the training of assessors and the training of the general public. This end-to-end process covers everything in the payment transaction flow. Everything from the creation of a payment card to provisioning of payment credentials to a device, to the payment equipment, the software you put on that equipment, the environments the data is processed, stored, and transmitted in. Now, the PCI Council has 9 standards. Almost every time when someone is talking to me about the PCI Council, they're talking about the PCI Data Security Standard, or the PCI DSS. This is most likely the standard you are most familiar with. This is the standard that governs what a service provider or what a merchant must comply with from a security standards standpoint. It is the original standard. It's actually roughly about 15 years old now. It predates the Council's existence. But it is just one of 9 standards. We have 8 other standards published today. These cover payment applications, terminals, as I mentioned, card production, and newer technologies such as point-to-point encryption and token service providers. We have 2 new standards that are in development and will be published by the end of the year. One is for mobile PIN, software entry on a mobile device. And the second is around the security requirements for 3DS2 protocol. So 11 standards by the end of the year. PCI Council also manages the assessors that assess against those standards. So this includes training those assessors, examining those assessors, and certifying them. We have a number of assessor types. You can see them on the screen. We have a new assessor type that we hope to launch at the end of this year, beginning of next year, and this is the Associate QSA. So if you ever worked with a PCI auditor, you probably worked with what's called a Qualified Security Assessor, or QSA. The associate program will be a new program. It'll be a lower cost program. It'll be a program to build a pipeline of new QSAs. We're considering it more of a junior level QSA, and that'll be launched later this year. Lots of benefits to the industry. All told, the PCI Council trains, examines, and certifies 6,500 professionals around the world every year. We do this in multiple languages, nearly on every continent in many countries. We also have labs that do laboratory testing of products and services tied to standards. They're represented in 8 different countries. Again, as a global body, we have a global footprint. Now, the PCI Council is an open global forum. I want to talk a little bit about that open part and how you can play a role and how the RSPA does play a role. First of all, we have this concept of a participating organization. We have 816 of them today. Participating organizations, and some of you guys are participating organizations, or your companies are. The RSPA is one itself. These are organizations that sign up to participate in the standard setting process with the PCI Council. So it's an open process. Participating organizations have a long list of benefits of being a PO. A couple of them that I'd like to highlight. One is being able to participate and request for comment periods on new and existing standards. The other is to be able to participate on task forces and special interest groups that help guide us at a working group level as to the actual work we are doing in creating standards and guidance and programs. And then finally, it's being able to run for and vote on the PCI Board of Advisors. The Board of Advisors directly advises our executive committee on the strategic direction of the PCI Council. They serve 3-year terms. We actually just started a brand new 3-year term a few weeks ago with a kickoff meeting. You'll notice the RSPA is one of our 29 members. We're very excited to have them on board and excited to work with the RSPA and with all of you over the next 3 years. In addition to the Board of Advisors, we need to make sure that the PCI standards and programs have global adaptability and suitability. And we do that by partnering with different organizations around the world that are more focused on a particular country or a specific region. These partnerships help us ensure that the standards and programs we create can be adapted, used successfully all over the world. Again, as a global body with global standards. Now I want to talk a little bit about data breaches. If there's only one thing you remember from our talk today, it's the next 3 words: secure remote access. Just those 3 words. It's the most important thing to remember. 80% of all account data compromise events for the past decade, 80%, were directly a result of insecure remote access. Most often weak password, default or null password, and single-factor authentication. 8 out of 10 data compromises in the past decade, insecure remote access. We're going to talk a lot about remote access here in the next couple slides and with our panel. That is the #1 thing to please take away: secure remote access. It's a complicated topic. There's a lot of technical details behind properly securing remote access. 2 things I would like to point out now. The first is, if you don't need remote access, turn it off. And a lot of times when we're looking at the forensic analysis of merchants, we find during that forensic analysis that they have remote access enabled. This often surprises the merchant. They didn't know it was enabled. They did not know why. Often this is a result of when a terminal or a point of sale system was installed, remote access was either on by default, or the installer turned it on not really knowing why or the security implications of turning that on. Unfortunately, when they do that, they do it in an insecure fashion, using single-factor authentication, maybe a default password, which is usually a password, or no password at all. So if you don't need remote access, turn it off. If you do need it, and there's a lot of legitimate use cases to have remote access, and a lot of you as service providers probably need remote access into your clients' environments, it's really important to do it in a secure fashion. There's a lot of technical requirements that go into securing remote access properly. The #1 I would want to point out is multi-factor authentication. Simply having a username and password, even a good password, is not sufficient for remote access. You must have 2 form factors of authentication. So the form factors are something you have, something you know, something you are. So for example, a password is something you know, something you are might be biometrics, or something you have might be a hard token. It's important to use at least 2 of those for authentication to remote access. Now there's a lot of other threats we see in the payment card space. Some have been around for the past 10 years, some have changed. Our standards are technology standards. Technology is constantly changing. It's changing even more rapidly today. As such, our standards change to adapt to the changes in that technology. We also have to adapt our standards based on our adversaries. Our adversary is organized crime. Organized criminals are constantly changing their tactics to carry out their breaches, either using new technologies or finding exploits in new technologies, or using the old exploits that still work. So we're constantly changing and evolving standards to address evolving threats and evolving criminal tactics. Now for the next couple slides, what I'd like to do is use a simple, more relatable, memorable analogy to illustrate the key points of the next few slides. So if you can, imagine a petty crook, a small-time crook, petty thief. This criminal's crime of choice is breaking into automobiles and stealing anything of value. And over time, he's gotten better and better at what he's done, and he's determined that he doesn't want to do a smash and grab of 1 or 2 cars. He only gets a few items of value. He wants to hit hundreds or thousands of automobiles at once. And so the plan he's devised is to hit a sports stadium. Sports stadiums are great for what he needs. Lots of cars, hundreds of thousands of cars in the parking lot, and all the people are in the stadium. Now the criminal's got 2 ways he can carry out his attack. #1, he could do the smash and grab. He can take a hammer, walk up to the car, smash in the window, grab whatever he can, and go to the next car. Now this is the fastest way to attack, and for a targeted attack, that may make sense. But unfortunately, he wants to hit hundreds or thousands of cars in this parking lot. So if he takes a hammer, smashes in a window, anyone sees that, that's abnormal behavior. They're probably going to take an action, call the police, call 911. And he's also likely going to set off some car alarms, which is also going to drive a lot of attention. That's not going to be good if he wants to break into hundreds or thousands of cars. So he's going to go with option number 2. That's the crime of opportunity. He's not going to target any specific car. He's going to go after all of them. He's going to walk up to the first car and try and open the door. If it's locked, that's okay. He'll move on to the next one. If that is locked, okay. He'll move to the next one. Eventually, he will find an unlocked car door. When he does, he's going to open the door very nicely, sit in the front seat, and close the door, just like he owns the car. To anyone watching, that's pretty normal behavior. Nothing unusual occurred. While he's in the car, he is going to look for anything of value. That might be jewelry, it might be cash, it might be an iPad. Anything of value is fair game. He's going to pocket that. He's going to open the car door nicely and close it, just like he was never there. Now, there's 2 things these automobile owners could have done to prevent that simple attack, which he'll continue over and over. Just keep looking for that unlocked car door through thousands of cars at this sporting event. 2 simple things would have prevented this. Number 1, you could have locked your front door. Locking the doors would have prevented that attack, right? He was going for the crime of opportunity. Number 2 is to not have anything of value in the car. Even if you forgot to do number 1, you left your car door unlocked, if there was nothing in the automobile, you can't be robbed. If there's nothing to steal, you cannot be robbed. So 2 simple things these automobile owners could have done to prevent those attacks. So let's talk about data breaches in the card payment space. Very similar. The first thing a merchant asks when we go on site and tell them you've been breached is, why me? Why? I'm small, mom and pop shop on Main Street, USA. Why are a Russian criminal organization targeting me? I'm just a small mom and pop shop. The answer is they did not target you. You're not targeted. It's a crime of opportunity. Just like scanning the cars in a parking lot looking for the unlocked door, it is organized criminal networks. So this is not small-time petty crooks. It's not 2 guys in a garage having fun. They are very well-funded, sophisticated, highly intelligent, and well-equipped organized criminal networks carrying out crimes of opportunity. They're quite simply scanning the open internet, scanning ranges of IP addresses, looking for a very specific vulnerability, and that is insecure remote access. Now, it's somewhat easy to find because very certain ports are used for certain remote access products. So they're scanning the wide open internet for open ports to look for remote access open doors, usually single-factor authentication. If they find an open access or a port that's open and it's 2-factor authentication, they'll probably move on. They're not going to try and target attack a merchant. They're looking for an open door, a crime of opportunity. But once they find that crime of opportunity, they're going to go in. Now, they don't know what that IP address is for. It might be that small mom and pop shop on Main Street, USA. It might be a massive global retailer. It could be a website, government, nonprofit. It could be your personal computer at home. They don't know, but they'll go in because the door is open. It's a crime of opportunity. And when they get in, they're going to very quietly look for anything of value. They're not targeting payment card data, although payment card data is, of course, of value. So if they find payment card data, they'll take that. But they'll happily take healthcare data, personally identifiable information, intellectual property, anything that could be of value to that criminal network, they will take. They will do it quietly, and they will leave just as quietly as they came. They're trying not to get caught. It's a crime of opportunity. It is not a targeted attack. Now, just like with the auto break-in, there's really 2 simple things that would prevent the vast majority of these. Now, this is not going to prevent every compromise, and it's definitely not going to prevent the targeted compromises where you're really going after the massive data breaches, but it will prevent the vast majority of what we see in the small merchant space. So 2 things that could be done. The first, and this is the equivalent of locking your car door, call it the 2 Ps, passwords and patching. Now, passwords might be a little oversimplified because when we're talking about remote access, we're also talking about authentication using 2 form factors and a couple other requirements. But having that strong authentication, that unique password, meeting all the password requirements in the PCI standards, and patching, these 2 things, which are actually fairly simple, cheap, and free to do, would prevent the vast majority of compromise events that we see. We're going to talk about getting the valuables out of the car in just a moment. First, let's talk about some strategic priorities of the PCI console. First, global and industry partnerships. PCI Console is focused as a strategic priority to expand partnerships outside of the US and outside of the EU and to have that global footprint of partnerships with strategic organizations around the world that really play a role in payment security. This includes vertical focus and specific industry partnerships, and the RSPA is a great example of that. It's one of the reasons why I am here today speaking to you. You guys are the boots on the ground. You absolutely are a big part of the solution to the account data compromise issues we see. And so it's a strategic priority for us to be a partner and to work with you. So we're very excited to be able to do that. Second is being more future focused. Rather than talking about what you should have been doing yesterday or what you should be doing today from a security standpoint, we have a good idea of where technology is going next year and the year after that. And we have a good idea, based on past experience, what the criminal tactics will be to attack that new technology. And it is crime. These are criminals. They don't go away. They will always find a new way to attack us. So we have to stay one step ahead of the game. So it's another strategic priority to have that more future focused, to be issuing guidance, information, and education about what is coming, not just what is here today. And then finally, simplified solutions for merchants. So I want to go back to that analogy. We talked about locking the car door, passwords, and patching. How about we get the data out of the merchant environment altogether? Just take the merchants out of the payment security space in the first place. That's really how we win and beat these criminals. So that's our ultimate goal, is to devalue the data such that it is useless for criminals, such that even if the merchant forgets to lock their door, there's nothing to steal in the first place. We do that with a simple equation. This is for the card-present brick-and-mortar merchant. It's EMV plus point-to-point encryption plus tokenization. These three technologies working together devalue and desensitize the payment card data such that what's in the merchant environment is absolutely useless. If a criminal got to it, it would be worthless. Nothing they could do with it. They could not have subsequent fraud, and therefore they would not have an account data compromise event. That's our ultimate goal. Now, in just 20 minutes, I have talked through quite a bit of information at a very high level. There are a lot of very technical details behind everything I have talked about. The good news is the details are free and available to the public. Both the PCI console at PCIsecuritystandards.org and MasterCard at our free education website, mastercard.com/PCI360, offer free to the public educational resources and details behind everything I've talked about and that we're going to talk about on this panel. This includes websites. The PCI console is an excellent new blog I'd suggest you checking out, a large FAQ database, guidance documents, infographics, videos, Twitter, Facebook accounts. We try and communicate all of this information in every means possible. So please check all of that out. If you're interested in knowing a lot more about PCI and the PCI console, we do have events just like RetailNOW that we do around the world. We did our Asia Pacific one a few months ago. The Latin American event is this week. For here in North America, in a few weeks' time in Orlando, we will have a week-long event, Everything PCI. It's a really good event, and if you're interested in knowing a lot more about the PCI console, would encourage you to attend. So with that, I want to shift to have a more focused conversation on the small merchant. We want to talk about small merchant data breaches, what we see from a forensic standpoint, and then talk about what we can do as an industry, as service providers, as payment brands, as the PCI console, what we can do to help these small merchants avoid these account data compromise events. So in order to do that, I'm going to have two industry experts join me. So if you could please join me in welcoming Mark Shellhart and Lauren Holloway. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lauren. If we could start with just a brief introduction. Mark, can you tell everyone a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name is Mark Shellhart. I work for a company called Sikich, formerly 403 Labs. I've been working data breaches and incident response and investigations for about 15 to 16 years now, a lot of it within PCI itself.
Thank you, Mark. And Lauren?
Yes, I'm Lauren Holloway, the Director of Standards Coordination at the Council. Currently, I work across both sides of the organization to make sure the standards work is well coordinated and messaged, across our various groups. And I've also been responsible for the PCI data security standard itself, as well as the payment application data security standard. And prior to working with the Council, I was at Visa for several years, where I was responsible for PCI DSS as well as their CISP program.
Well, thank you, Lauren. So Mark, you mentioned you are a PFI. Can you talk about what PFI is, the acronym, what a PFI does, and the role a PFI plays in payment security?
Sure, good question. PFI PCI forensic investigator. A PFI is an investigation. It's the call that you don't want to get from one of your merchants. Think of us as the fire department that responds to a data breach. We're there from the very first call of, hey, my customer is saying that they've been breached, or you've gotten a call from the bank saying, hey, there's a breach across all of your merchants. We're the ones that first walk in and say, this is probably what's going to happen, what we need to look at, but we're there to help put out the fire and then figure out at the very end, when did it start? When did it stop? How do we make sure that we get the attacker out of your environment and then lock things down so you don't have to go through it again? What caused the breach? What needs to change so we don't have to look at this again, and then you can get back to the point where you can sleep at night so you're not having to deal with this type of data. And there's a lot more to it than just the technical side. There's the technical side of it. There's the legal side. There's the PR side. There's the customer side of it. You've got vendors who are involved as well, and just the emotions behind all of it. The parts of the person who wrote the software, the person who installed it, all the emotions and the different people and the players that are involved in a data breach, and the cost behind it is overwhelming. We've seen so many of them since 2006. I think I've been at it for 11 years now, hence the gray hair. That's where it comes from. We've just seen enough that we can give back at that point and help you through that, be your tour guide to go through a breach. That's what the PFI is all about.
So Mark, a PFI clearly sees a lot.
Yes.
And you've had a lot of experience in this space. In looking at all the different forensic events that you have investigated, what are some common vulnerabilities that you usually see, both big and small merchants? I mean, what's kind of the most common vulnerabilities and issues that are plaguing merchants today?
Good question. I mean, going back, since doing this since 2006, we're the folks that whenever we show up on site, we're the ones that are digging in the back closet where the back house server is, or looking behind the terminals, for looking at the wiring and the messes. We're next to those slop sinks and those nasty restaurants and hotels that you've all been in as well. I've lived that life with you. But we see the same things. We've seen VNC a long time ago. We've seen PC Anywhere, but the attackers are getting smarter. We're still seeing remote access, as Adam said a few minutes ago. Remote access is big. Passwords are big. Patching, like he mentioned as well, is another big part of this as well, but that also goes with operating systems. Who still has customers that still have Windows XP out there? I'm sure there's a few hands in the room. I'm sure yes. It's a scary thing. Antivirus is another problem that we run into as well. Everybody assumes that I'll install antivirus once and leave it alone and things are going to be great. The attackers are getting smarter than the antivirus these days. You put it in, we see multiple attacks these days where the attackers are actually getting in, trying their malware, it fails, so they actually go into the antivirus product and put an exception for their malware in, so the antivirus is still running, but it is ignoring their actual executable and then moving on. They're getting that smart as a criminal to take that extra amount of time to get it in there. So it's still some of the very basic things, but it's time and time again, they're not letting up on the basics to get into these. So the very basic things that you do can stop some of the breaches we see.
Awesome. So given the audience is probably interested in point of sale systems, terminals, is there anything from a POS standpoint that you consistently see that's specific to that space that is causing a lot of breaches?
The front door and the opportunity really comes down to the remote access. We understand that a lot of integrators and a lot of big franchises as well, they're overworked and busy. If you're a successful company, a lot of times you have a large client base. And I'm not going to say that necessarily there's corners being cut, but it's hey, I'm going to get this up and running. I've got a printer down that I need to take care of in an hour. I'll come back later and reset the password, or I'll turn off remote access once I know that I'm done with the site, and then it's forgotten. Maybe you have 400 customers or 4,000 that you support, but leaving that remote access behind on one site gives the opportunity for the attacker to get in there, learn the passwords, learn the systems, learn the patterns, and attack others at that same point. So that remote access, or those little, very small security things in the very beginning, are the very simple things that the attacker goes after in the very beginning. Passwords, I think, is the biggest one still, is the weak passwords, or not having the multi-factor on the remote access is just the bane of the existence today. It's just painful.
So Mark, a lot of what you've talked about and what I've talked about is covered in the PCI data security standard. A lot of this is basic security as well. So Lauren, in my 10 years working with various PCI standards, we've gotten feedback that it's too prescriptive, it's not prescriptive enough, it looks like the tax code, this is confusing. And especially for the small merchants, the mom and pop on Main Street USA, they're not security professionals, they don't necessarily understand remote access and passwords. So what is the PCI Council doing to help the small merchant community understand what they need to do from a security perspective?
Yeah, in 2015, we formed a small merchant task force, which, as Adam said, is one of the benefits of being a participating organization. And this is really focused on small merchants. So the council itself doesn't have many small merchants. They're actually members, but we got members for this task force that do represent small merchants. We have acquirers, we have some small merchant franchise companies like Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory. So we really wanted people that focus on small merchants and can help them. And in 2016, we produced our first guidance documents. So that was really the goal, to come up with a resource that can help small merchants. So in 2016, in July of last year, we have a guide to safe payments, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. We have a simplified glossary. We have a set of common payment systems, which are really different diagrams of merchant payment systems. The idea is a merchant would go through them and say, oh, this looks like my system, and then there's information on the threats and the risks and the protections that would apply to that type of payment system. And we also have questions to ask your vendors, so something to help them to be able to talk to their vendors. So those, I think, have been really helpful documents. We've had a lot of really good press about them, so yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned the guide to safe payments, which I know you have a copy, and we have a bunch of copies at the booth that are available. It's one of the things that I have found to be the best work we've done at the PCI console. And ironically, it was done by the payments community. Lauren mentioned the task force that has been working on this, and it has been not the card brands, not the PCI staff, but it has been the wider community of participating organizations that really play in this space. And it's some of the best work we have done. So that was kind of phase one of the small merchant task force. Is there plans for a phase two, and what can we expect to come out here in the future focused on small merchants?
Yeah, right now the task force is looking at different validation options for small merchants. So it would be based on the same existing guidance, and we did work really hard to make sure this guidance is practical, non-technical, no jargon, no acronyms. We had to work really hard to eliminate all those types of things that everybody in tech loves, because we wanted it to be approachable. We wanted to explain it and very simple, that they could easily understand. So we're currently looking at validation options based on that same material, and we'll see where we could go with that. We're looking at possibly that would be a replacement for the SAQs, the self-assessment questionnaires that many merchants have to complete now. But really, as Adam said, that's up to the brands how they would use that tool. We just would produce, the forms, and then the brands would determine, what merchants is this applicable for and how they might use it. We're hoping to have something out early in 2018.
Excellent. And a lot of this gets down to, if you look at the PCI DSS, requirement 1 is around firewalls. When you go to that small mom and pop shop and ask them, hey, this first requirement, did you properly configure your firewall? They look at you deer in the headlights. They don't even know what a firewall is. And so it's really not going to help security of payments, asking them questions they don't understand. And so a lot of the goal of the small merchant material is to ask questions in basic English that folks like the mom and pop shop on Main Street can actually answer that will drive security. So keeping with this small merchant task force, Mark, you talked a little bit about the vulnerabilities you see kind of across the board. Is there anything really specific to the small merchant arena that you consistently see from a forensic standpoint?
Yep. Well, part of that is the human side of it as well, in all honesty. One of the biggest things that plagues small, medium business scenarios that we see with the breaches is you've got a staff that is just the right size to run that business. It's, I feed people, I run the restaurant, I run the kitchen. I don't take any days off during the week. They don't have an IT staff. It may be their nephew, it may be the person on the street. They may have enough time to reach out to one of you to trust them. But unless the printer's broken, if the system's running right to them, the last thing on their mind is security. So that lack of staff and that lack of detail there on security on their part is something that we run into, and we feel for them when they go through a data breach. But to your side as well, you're sitting there going, man, I know that Bill and Mary have this sub shop. I want to help them with security. I want to help them with antivirus. I want to make sure that they have a firewall. I want to tell them about remote access. But if I do that, am I assuming the liability at that point? If they get breached and I let them down in some way, am I getting drug into this as well? So one of the first things we run into is that problem of where does the liability lay? And then you get to the point where you do have attackers out there that are attacking multiple businesses that are all within your portfolio as well. So you may have 40 merchants that are all breached, and you're thinking, well, crud, is there going to be 40 investigations and 40 of my customers getting mad at me that I'm going to lose money as well? So the liability across that, and do I want to step in and assume and help them with the PR and help them through that as well? So the human side and the liability is something that's really big there. The other thing that we're running into with the small mom and pop, because they have the small shop, is we have the persistence. We have the attacker that gets in there, and they'll say, I'm going to steal 2 or 3 cards from this system over here, and 4 or 5 from over here, and maybe 6 over here, and then I'm going to stop for the week. I'm not going to let greed get to that point. So I may break into a car, and I may take the iPad, but not something else out of the car, so I can stay in there. So the person may think, did I just lose it? So I can get to the point where I can keep stealing cards from those same systems over and over and over again. So being able to get in there and getting them cleaned up and make sure that the attacker's out is a big problem that we have with small and medium businesses these days. So those are the things that we struggle with. The internet is the other problem. You have these businesses that say, hey, I want this point of sale system. I don't want to pay for another computer. I want to check my email on it. I want to run Pandora on it. I want to do all these other things on here that make my business happy and run. This computer's great. Why should I spend money on a second one? Sharing those other applications opens up other doors for them, and they just don't understand what that is. And you may not have time, or they may not understand or want to listen to what those differences is. They want that one computer that can do everything. So cost and thought about security, it's those things and the human element that are the biggest problems we see with SMB these days.
So, Lauren, in the SMB material that the council's produced, is there any guidance or additional requirements or information that's offered that may touch on some of the things Mark just covered?
Yes, Adam, we've included what we based this material on in the first place was the ways we keep seeing and hearing that merchants are getting breached. So we're hoping that they can do 10 things really well and ignore the other 250 or whatever there are in PCI DSS. So this is the guide to safe payments, as I mentioned. This is the only one that's in a paper version. The others are all electronic only. Of course, you can print them if you want, but this is a paper one, and we have a booth here, and they're going to have plenty of these. So if you want to go grab some, that would be good. Included in here, this table keeps getting referenced over and over, and I don't want to look back there to see if you can see it, but it's on page 12 in the guide, and what this is the 12 areas that are covered in the guide, and it includes cost, ease of implementation, and risk mitigation. So for each one, like the first one, which is use strong passwords and change default ones, it's low cost, it's only 1 coin, it's easy to implement, it's only 1 wrench, and the risk mitigation is 3, which is the maximum risk mitigation. So they can get a lot of benefit from doing something easy. And this table kind of walks through all of the 12 items that are in here. And each of the 12 is only 1 page. So this is use strong passwords and change default ones here. And the next one is, they're all just 1 page. So they're, as I said, designed to be easy to understand, no tech jargon, brief. So hopefully they can read, 1 page and say, okay, now I understand why that's important to me.
So we've talked a lot about merchants and the merchant perspective. Insecure remote access is clearly one of the biggest issues that we face from a security perspective. That insecure remote access has to come from somewhere, and that's often from service providers. So Mark, from a forensic standpoint, when these service providers are compromised, and the 40 merchants that their clients are compromised, what are you seeing from a forensic standpoint that's causing the compromises of the service providers, and what could the service provider and the merchant do to prevent those type of breaches?
Very good question. The first thing that I would suggest is, if you can really do it with some of your merchants, turn it off. Plain and simple, just turn off remote access. Don't let them use it. What we're also preaching these days is, if you've got a specific product that you use, such as LogMeIn, make sure that the others aren't on there as well. Get rid of TeamViewer, get rid of BombGuard, get rid of all the others, and make sure that the client is only using the one product. Because you get that one person who goes, oh, I'm going to install this for a minute because this other vendor needs to dial in for a minute. No, make them use the one product. Single out on that one product, and then watch the logs. Yeah, it's got an overhead, but if you can see in your logs, there's many times we'll see a breach. We'll see 400 merchants breached in one night, and they're all coming from this one IP address in Portugal. And it's walking through every one of your merchants. We have one attacker that's out there right now that we've seen in the logs. We call him the midnight to 5 a.m. bandit, because they come in with LogMeIn access, and he can only break into about 60 restaurants at a night. But a lot of the integrators that we see may have 300 or 3,000 different merchants. He'll start at midnight, he'll stop at 5 a.m. so none of the people see the mouse moving on the screen. So he'll walk across all the different restaurants. At 5 a.m., he'll turn off his greed. He'll go to bed. I don't know where he necessarily lives, but he won't start again until at night at midnight again and go to the next restaurants. It may take him 6 or 7 days to infect all these different restaurants, but he'll use that remote access tool and he'll walk across them. So watching your logs through remote access is critical. Again, if you're not using it, please turn it off. I know that we all have customers that are on the other side of town or 3 hours away or away someplace where you don't have tech resources. If you can get to the point where we're not using it, the liability worth of driving and having the drive charge, I know it sounds insane, you may be better off without remote access in some cases. But if you do need to use it, make it something where you're doing the multi-factor authentication, or you're doing something at least where you're calling into the restaurant and making Betty stay after saying, Betty, I know that you need to go home, but I need to do system upgrades tonight, so I need you to stay with me on Tuesday night between 10 and 11 p.m. so I can get logged in. It's the nature of the beast of where we are today. That change needs to happen. The remoting in when you want to fix a printer issue because you don't know when you're going to get to it and you want to do it at 3 a.m., it's got to stop. Because if you leave it on all the time, unfortunately, you're going to walk into a data breach at some point. I don't want to sell the fear, but it's the reality that we're seeing.
So Lauren, with the small merchant material, have we done anything specific for guidance on working with service providers and for small merchants, what questions and what they should be looking at in terms of security of their service providers?
Yes, we have, one of the 12 is use trusted business partners, and so we talk a lot about, what is a service provider, and we also include questions to ask your vendors, which is a separate document that includes a series of questions to ask your vendors on different topics. It helps merchants to understand what types of vendors are out there. There's a table in there of here's the different vendors you might encounter, here's what they'll do for you, here's which PCI standard would impact this particular vendor, whether it's QIR or maybe it's PADSS if it's a payment application, or PCI DSS. And this document also includes lists of links to all the lists, the PCI Council lists of the various lists that we have, and it includes links to MasterCard and Visa's list of approved service providers. So we tried to be a compendium of resources there that they can turn to and hopefully understand how better to understand their vendors and what they might do for them.
Excellent. So we're about out of time. Lauren, Mark, and I will be available afterwards during the lunch break for any questions or additional dialogue you might want to have. Thank you all for listening, and a special thank you to the RSPA for inviting us here today. We're very excited to be a part of this. Thank you.